Hello, and welcome to Other Voices Online, a monthly conversation for activists brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. As you're all aware, Congress recently passed and the president signed the Inflation Reduction Act. The bill has drawn a lot of positive attention because of its historic commitment of nearly $370 billion aimed at mitigating climate change. For this edition of Other Voices, we'll take a look at what's in the legislation, what is not in it, and what more needs to be done to address the climate emergency, both here in the US and globally. To guide us through all this, I'm really pleased to welcome back to the program Chris Field, Director of Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment. Chris is the Melvin and Joan Lane Professor of Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies and is a former co-chair of the Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability Working Group of the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change. Chris, welcome back to Other Voices, and thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. So let's start with the big picture before we get into the nuts and bolts of the legislation that just passed. The last time you were on our program, when we were still in the TV studio pre-pandemic, was about 5.5 years ago. You and your colleagues had just gotten back from the 1-year anniversary meeting, the Conference of Parties, following the Paris Agreement. It was also right after Donald Trump had been elected. And I remember you telling me on that program that you learned of his election, I think, on the flight over. And
that's true.
You were kind of worried about what it would do to the mood. And you were happy to report that everyone was still positive, committed to moving forward, regardless of what Trump might do. He did end up pulling us out of the Paris Agreement, which President Biden quickly reversed. But can you characterize in some way what we've lost in these past 4+ years because of total inaction out of Washington? I know it's not something
sure. And you know, the picture is mixed. There's been some important progress on climate, but I think what's been missing is the essence of leadership, and there's recognition around the world that for us to make the kind of commitments and make the kind of progress that we need on climate, there needs to be leadership from the rich countries, and especially from the United States, that's the largest historic emitter and has the most resources to commit to developing solutions. And that absence of leadership during the Trump administration kind of took the air out of the tires for the international progress. And I think that it also contributed to a kind of a history of distrust of the US and its commitment in this area, and something that traces back to the failure of the US to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And we've seen again and again that the US has moments of clear commitment, and then other periods when it steps back and lets the leadership languish. One of the things that's going to be so important for progress in the next steps is a consistent commitment to being a leader in this area. And I hope that the Inflation Reduction Act really nails down the ability of the US to start rebuilding its credibility as a leader in climate commitment.
So, and you know, this has gotten a lot of attention here because it is really the first major bill consciously addressing climate change. President Obama got a lot of good stuff for climate change in his rescue package many years ago. I think a lot of people aren't aware of how packed that was with benefits for like the solar industry and things like that. But hopefully, will this be seen as a positive signpost that the United States is back on track in terms of that leadership role?
You know, I'm not sure I can speak for the international community broadly on this. The international community is rich and diverse. I'm sure this is a very positive signal, and I know there are lots of countries that are keen to see the U.S. reassert its leadership role, but there's lots of historic distrust, and there have been lots of other times when it seemed like the U.S. was really stepping up to the challenge and then step back. And so I think we're going to have to deliver on the commitment in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think we're going to have to exhibit some staying power to rebuild or to build the trust of the international community. And it is going to require an international effort, but that international effort is going to falter again and again if we don't have the strong leadership from the US.
Well, let's talk for a minute about that international effort. The Paris Climate Agreement, I think, said something like we needed to reduce carbon emissions to pre-industrial levels, something at the rate about 75% by 2030. This bill that just passed says it'll be 40% here by 2030. The Build Back Better bill, the original one, had a target of 50% by 2030. How's the world doing meeting these targets? Are we making any progress, or are we falling further behind with every year that slips by without major action?
Unfortunately, we are falling further behind every year. If you look at the trajectory of global total emissions of heat-trapping gases, there was substantial decrease from 2019 to 2020 that was associated with the pandemic and the economic disruption it caused. And then there was a substantial increase from 2020 to 2021. We haven't seen the numbers for 2022 yet, but my expectation is that we'll continue to see very high levels that have not yet begun to go down at the global level, although they may be approximately stable on a year-to-year basis. We've seen substantial decreases in some countries, especially countries in the rich world, and the U.S. is substantially below its peak emissions, and so there are signs of progress, but we're not anywhere close to a trajectory that makes us consistent with either the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is stabilization of the global temperature at well below 2°C above pre-industrial. And we certainly are not on track for anything close to and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5°C above pre-industrial. There's actually a huge difference between those two numbers, and it sounds like they're kind of the same, and maybe well below 2 and 1.5 are about the same. But in terms of when we need to reach zero emissions for 1.5, the whole world would need to reach zero emissions by about mid-century. And for 2°C, that number stretches out into the 2080s or 2090s. And so, well below 2 would probably put us somewhere in the region of 2070. And that's a big difference in terms of the transition the world needs to make. And as you say, there doesn't seem to be any country now that's on track to reduce its emissions consistent with this 1.5-degree goal.
Yeah, as I always do when we are working with Celsius numbers, I had to look up how it translates to what I was raised on, the Fahrenheit. And 1.5 is, you talked about what seems like a small difference, so that people can catch this. 1.5°C is 34.7 degrees Fahrenheit, and 2.0°C is 35.65. So it's about a 1 degree difference on the thermometers that we use around here. What is the difference to the planet between 1.5 and 2?
The big reason that there is a totally appropriate focus on making the target as low as possible is that we have high confidence that we're approaching a number of really consequential tipping points in the way the climate system works. Some of these tipping points will be expressed through the severity of the impacts. How much sea level rise will we experience? Are we committed to a sea level rise of several inches, or are we committed to a sea level rise of several tens of feet? And we know there's some kind of a threshold where especially in Antarctica, the major ice sheets become unstable. And even if we were to cool after passing this threshold, we would still be committed to a very large amount of sea level rise, tens of feet, over a period that would probably be several centuries, but would be totally existential for many low-lying countries. So some of them are related to impacts. Some are related to how much warming we experience. And we know, for example, that there's much more carbon frozen in frozen soils in Siberia than there is in the atmosphere. And then as those frozen soils thaw, the carbon that's in them decomposes into carbon dioxide and methane, even more powerful greenhouse gas. And we're pretty confident there's some point at which that thawing rate gets to be so high that no matter what we do with industrial emissions, there'll be more and more contribution of this thawing permafrost to the atmospheric greenhouse gases, driving further warming and putting us into a situation where even if we eventually bring industrial human emissions down to zero, we'll still see increased warming. So this kind of feedback trigger, super important. People have talked about a feedback trigger from mid-latitude wildfires, which of course we've had horrific experience with here in the West, where if the conditions get to be so extreme that wildfires are releasing much more carbon from forests and the forests are able to take up, we end up with a vicious cycle feedback that's adding additional greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, potentially independent of what we do with human industrial emissions. And then finally, I think it's important to think about impacts that might generate tipping points in what you might call social cohesiveness. The world is going to have to work together to effectively tackle the climate crisis. And as conditions get to be so desperate in countries that are impacted directly, countries, like the recent experience with the extreme flooding in Pakistan, or the drought that we're seeing across sub-Saharan Africa, those countries may lose the ability to really participate as regular members of the international community in developing solutions. So all these tipping points are issues of concern. We have a high confidence that these tipping points occur at some temperature, and that it's somewhere around this space of 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and we don't know exactly where those tipping points are. And so the real challenge we face is how to limit warming to stay a safe distance away from these tipping points that are totally transformative in what the world of the future looks like. And let me say just one other thing about the difference between 1.5 and 2. When we talk about solutions to the climate crisis, we often start and should start with mitigation, decreasing the amount of climate change that occurs. But it's important that we have a wide range of solutions we can deploy that are in the spirit of adaptation, helping people cope as effectively as possible with the climate changes that can't be avoided. And that includes things like improving infrastructure, raising bridges, making sure that cooling centers are available, lots and lots of strategies that can be helpful, not only for dealing with climate change, but for other things as well. And we have a pretty good understanding of how we can deploy these adaptation solutions for the kind of warming we've seen now and for increments on top of that. But once we get a lot more warming in the system, it becomes very challenging to figure out what adaptations might work and to figure out whether there's any way to adapt to the future conditions. And I think it's really important as we think about the targets and the stabilization to keep adaptation a viable option so that we can continue to have societies that function and ecosystems that are still continue to be vibrant. Once there's too much warming substantially above 2 Celsius, we really lose the ability to adapt effectively. So there are lots of reasons to focus on making this limit of warming as low as possible and build in a safety margin between where we stabilize and where we start crossing these really untenable tipping points.
It really drives home the fact that the United Nations calls this a climate emergency. That doesn't seem like an overwrought word to use in this situation. Who's doing a good job out there? Just briefly on the international scene, you kind of alluded to a couple countries doing some good stuff, or maybe above and beyond the call of duty. Are there any models to look at?
Yeah, I would say there are many bright spots. You know, the countries that are doing the best are doing it partly because they made good decisions and partly because of luck. You know, in the United States, I said we have seen substantial emissions reductions. In the US, well, some of it's due to policy, but a really major factor driving the emissions reductions in the US has been the replacement of much of the use of coal and electricity with natural gas. And that was really driven by the revolution in being able to get natural gas from hydraulic fracturing, from fracking. And it meant that all of a sudden electricity from gas was cheaper than electricity from coal. And of course, now in almost every setting, electricity from renewables is even cheaper than electricity from natural gas. But historically, the big driver of the emissions reductions in the US over the last several years has been this transition from coal to gas, driven largely by the fact that the gas was cheap relative to the coal. Other countries, especially European countries, have been more ambitious about deploying renewable energy solutions, although I've got to say that in many of those situations, there's been an element of luck or of even sort of fudging the books a little bit. And for example, in the power sector in the European Union, they had a decision that was just reversed a couple of weeks ago that energy from biomass should be considered emissions neutral. The idea being that biomass grows by removing CO2 to the atmosphere, from the atmosphere, and burning it puts the CO2 back. And there are lots of reasons that it's not really CO2 neutral, and you have to chop down the biomass and make it into pellets and ship it around and stuff that involves fossil. So it was kind of fudging the books to take full credit for the use of biomass and electricity, and I was pleased to see that the European Union reversed that rule. But it is important that the best actors over the last decade have really been in European countries.
Okay,
mostly pretty small countries.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at what this country has just done with this latest legislation. Again, it's 369, almost $370 billion. I think it's over 100 different programs are targeted in the bill. We certainly don't have time to go through everything that's
for sure
getting money. We'd be here all week. But well, let me ask you this way: is there any particular aspects of the bill that really stand out to you that make your eyes open wide?
Yeah. So let me say just a couple things that I think are really constructive, genuine, huge steps forward in the Inflation Reduction Act. One is having the commitment in legislation. Really important that it's coming from legislation and not from executive orders, and it makes it much less likely to be reversed by any future administration. The size is important, that making a commitment of hundreds of billions of dollars really has the financial leverage to change the picture and to demonstrate the commitment of the U.S. to the solving the problem.
Yeah.
A third thing that's important is that there is a real emphasis on making sure that the benefits of the funding are distributed between rich communities and poor communities, and between urban communities and rural communities. And that's extremely valuable and extremely important. And there also is a real commitment to making sure that the benefits are distributed between investments in mitigation, transitioning the energy system, and investments in adaptation and building resilience through things like drought programs and building energy efficiency programs and stuff like that. So the overall distribution is really thoughtful and really helpful. It's important to recognize that we ended up in a place where all of the climate investments are in the spirit of carrot and sticks. These are all carrots, and that we didn't end up with a bill that had any financial penalties associated with not changing fast enough. And most economists would argue that we would see bigger emissions reduction if the package did include some mix of financial incentives and financial penalties. But the politics of where we ended up meant that the bill, even though it pays for itself, uses only incentives in the climate side. Yeah,
and on that point, I was interested to learn that in the bill, the incentives usually from the government are tax incentives, but they've structured this so that nonprofit organizations that do not pay taxes can participate in a lot of these, especially community-based programs, by actually getting direct financial payments made to them because they don't have taxes to save on. And so that should really help spur things on this. I think that's an important point you brought up, that it's incentive-based. Even though most of it is tax deduction, there's a benefit there for people doing this.
Yeah, for example, there's a green bank that is specifically set up to provide funding for lower income entities that want to deploy solutions in a serious way. And I can't remember the amount of $20 billion committed to a green bank. It's real money that can really make a difference.
Yeah. So just some of the points that stand out to me, as I mentioned earlier, in the rescue program that President Obama passed many, many years ago, there was a big kickstart for the solar industry, and solar has come along, and wind has come along in the ensuing years because of some of these incentives. And this bill that just passed seems to include a really next important step, and that's a lot of focus on energy storage from these renewable things, and a lot of money going into a standalone investment tax credit specifically for energy storage projects, which will support all sorts of storage technologies. That's a pretty critical element in this whole getting over to renewables, isn't it?
Absolutely. The big challenge we face with high penetration of renewable energy is you have to have some way to deliver electricity when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. And in the United States, that we've done that primarily using either fossil-based electricity or nuclear-based electricity. Hydropower can do that, although there's big issues with hydropower and the drought we're seeing in the West.
Yes.
And eventually, we're going to need to figure out some way to provide massive amounts of energy storage. And everybody's aware of the progress we've made with battery technology for electric vehicles, but those batteries are still really expensive. Yes. And the challenge of being able to provide electricity for, a major city for a dreary, cloudy, cold, and windless winter month is a really, really big challenge. And there are many incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act for what's called green or blue hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, and there's a lot of hope that being able to use renewable electricity to make hydrogen and then use the hydrogen as the energy storage medium will contribute to this ability to do massive scale storage. Lots of exciting work going on with different battery technologies that may be substantially cheaper than the other technologies we have. Continued progress on things like pumped hydro, where in the places that are appropriate, you pump the water up the hill during the day and let it flow down through the turbines at night. Provide other options, but the bottom line is that if you say, what is the technology area that's most limiting for our ability to have 100% renewable economy, it's still this large scale long-term storage.
So this is definitely a big step in the right direction here, because that industry hasn't gotten any attention as far as I know so far.
Yeah, and you can sort of see why in the countries that have been most ambitious about the transition to renewable, and often they're ones that were where they already had developed fossil-based infrastructure or nuclear infrastructure or hydro. And also it's an area where you really need fundamental research progress. At the same time, you need large-scale deployment to drive the prices down. And one of the things that the Inflation Reduction Act does is recognize that we need basic research in some of these energy technologies, especially those associated with large-scale storage.
Okay. Another major element that caught my eye is a lot of money, tens of billions of dollars for home electrification. Could you talk about that a minute? And
sure.
How important that is?
And if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, something like 40% are associated with building operations, and really a lot of those are building heating and cooling. And in most parts of the world, in most parts of the U.S., building heating is still with natural gas, with furnaces that vary dramatically in their efficiency, vary in whether or not they're leaking methane to the atmosphere, and there are huge opportunities in transitioning buildings away from being consumers of fossil fuels to being all electric. And the heat pump technology that's just recently become mature. I installed a heat pump in my home this summer.
We did
really,
too.
yeah, I think that it really makes sense in California now. And it also, allows you to be.
There's terrific rebate programs out there. We should mention.
Yeah, there are financial incentives. You can save money because they're so efficient compared to other forms of heating, and it also is, it's a really mature technology, so that the basic infrastructure isn't that expensive, and there's still, it's a capital expense for families, and it's a burden to lift, but the Inflation Reduction Act is focused on making that a feasible thing to do. And that's one of the places we can get the biggest bump, especially in California, where most of our emissions associated with transportation. So the Inflation Reduction Act commitment to action on vehicle electrification, also really important. But kind of, second is buildings and the things we can do with buildings. And then what's left after that is getting to be pretty challenging. It's mainly the emissions that are associated with manufacturing and agriculture, where we really need a mix of advances in our fundamental understanding and the fundamental technologies, and a lot of scaling.
Yeah, the home electrification, by the way, is one of the areas you made reference to it earlier. How much in this bill is aimed at what we call environmental justice, that these are not just for big building owners and stuff. They're for every community to electrify their homes and upgrade their efficiency.
Yes, that is certainly the intent, and I think it's going to be important for all of us to pay attention to the implementation to make sure that that philosophy of just access to these incentives is really preserved. I think there's going to be a tendency for the powerful actors to try and grab onto the resources, and I think there's an opportunity for the public to be engaged in being vigilant about making sure that the law's intention really gets executed.
Yeah, there's 15 billion for projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions in low income and disadvantaged communities.
Yeah,
that's a lot of money to be pouring into communities. Just before we turn to our audience for their contributions to this, I want to note there's apparently a lot of money for trying to decarbonize air travel. We hear a lot about electric cars, but we still have a lot of jetliners flying around, burning up a lot of stuff. It's from the notes I have, about 3% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from air travel, and globally, I'm sure that's quite a bit. It looks like I'm not finding the figure here for it's tax credits basically per gallon for sustainable fuels. And right now it seems to be people mixing things like hamburger grease into kerosene to come up with
It's just sustainable aviation. I mean, kind of, it's a little bit of an oxymoron now, but there is progress on sustainable aviation fuels. The big challenge is that so far we don't have a way to scale up the quantities. If you're going to make the fuel from hamburger grease, which is, we have the technology for that, there just isn't that much hamburger grease relative to the amount of fuel that aviation requires. And there are lots of good ideas out there about making sustainable aviation fuels, but I think that's an area where we're going to need to see continued fundamental research, and it's not exactly clear what the path will be, but it's very likely that the path to net zero emissions is going to have to involve some combination of making the fuels better and offsetting the emissions that don't get addressed by making the fuels better. One of the important things about the impact of aviation on climate change is that it's more than just the CO2 in the airliner exhaust, because the combustion of kerosene jet A also produces massive amounts of water vapor. You get a substantial fraction of the warming. Most estimates are more than half of the warming from jet travel is a result of this water vapor being added to the upper parts of the atmosphere. And there's some formulations of sustainable aviation fuels that might address part of that, but we're going to have to do more, and almost certainly in the offset space, if we want to have truly sustainable aviation fuel. And there are lots of good reasons to think about continuing to emphasize things like high-speed rail as an alternative where it's practical.
Okay. And before I bring our audience in, I'll just make one last quick note. I got a kick out of seeing that there's $3 billion in there for electric mail trucks. After Lois DeJoy went out and ordered all these gas trucks.
That's a little bit sort of, walking the walk. If the government is going to be incentivizing the transition to electric transportation, they ought to be doing it with the vehicles they use for their services.
That's right. The federal government has a lot of vehicles,
and a lot of them are mail trucks.
Yes, it's incredible how many mail trucks there are. By the way, 212,000 mail trucks. So,
I'm not surprised.
and we currently have 24 electric mail trucks out of the 212,000. So let me invite our guests here, our audience members here to participate. You can either put in a question into the chat and I'll read it off. We do like to bring you on camera. So if you click on the raise your hand thing, our director who's working behind the scenes here, Sean, will bring you on camera. You'll see your screen disappear briefly, and then when you come back on, you'll actually be listed as a panelist. You'll need to turn your audio and video back on yourself. We can't control that from this side. So we've got a first questioner here, DP, and I see you've got your audio on. What's your question?
Hi, thank you, Paul and Chris. One of the things I wanted to ask about is the tax breaks and the rebates. I sounds like both of you are pretty knowledgeable about this issue and the complexities of it. And so you know that there's all kinds of state incentives, local incentives, federal incentives, and now with the IRA going forward, there's more changes into the incentives that the feds are going to provide. So my question is there somewhere where there's a comprehensive one-stop shop type of website where you can go and find all of the different incentives for heat pumps and cars and solar panels and so on? Because I've looked, I haven't found one. And so I started in on trying to make something like that. And if there isn't anything like that, then maybe you could help steer me in the direction of getting some assistance on putting something together. I know that's a big ask potentially, but anyhow, that's my question. Thank you.
It's a great question.
It's a great question, David.
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer. I would hope that it's a work in progress and that other folks are taking the same approach that you're taking of providing a kind of a comprehensive way to figure out what's out there and what's not. I think it will be really, really valuable and important to have. Also, I think that I'm hoping that there will be lots of channels for accessing information through the providers of the services, the folks who are selling the electric vehicles or the heat pumps. And I'm also hoping that it will turn out that on the tax forms, it's really clear how you claim the credits. But I admire your commitment to figuring out how to contribute to this conversation.
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do for the Peace and Justice Center to contribute to this conversation. If anybody wants to work with David on this project, drop me an email and I'll put you all in touch. I'm paul@peaceandjustice.org. Maybe we can get a group together that are interested in this. After you emailed me this question, David, and again, I apologize that I totally missed your email for about a week, but I did take a look around, and I know our service provider here, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, has a list of all the rebates that they offer. So the information is out there, but it's in little bits and pieces. I think the idea of putting it all together in a one-stop shop is just a really helpful idea. So thanks a lot.
And one more thing, what I just found today is the White House has put out a website about the IRA and the tax breaks and so on related to that. I looked at it and it's really well-designed website, but the information is kind of, basic, like, what would you say, 101 level. And I even found a link or two that's got old information. So anyhow, thanks, Paul. And Chris, maybe I'll get in touch with you if you can think of anybody that, a grad student that wants to join in on this. I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I think making this a citizen science effort or a citizen policy support effort sounds terrific.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks again. Sean, just keep bringing people on who raise their hands. Don't wait till the previous questioner goes off. But so I see we have Debbie and Mike in line, and let me see if there's any written questions that I can. Please ask Dr. Field about the huge extraction requirements for shifting off fossil fuels. Do you know what this person is referring to about extraction requirements for getting off of fossil fuels?
I mean, there is a lot of concern about mining of the minerals that are required for the renewable energy technologies, whether it's, niobium for the magnets in windmills or for the rare earths that are required in photovoltaics. And we do need to put a lot more effort into making sure that the mineral extraction for the renewable energy systems is managed in a way that is sustainable and a lot more sustainable than it is now. It's a real blind spot in the way that the renewable energy technology has proceeded until now, and it has the potential for real crises in the future if we don't pay more attention to it.
Okay, well, thank you for that excellent question, Gregory Slater. And then let's go to Debbie Mytels. Hi, Debbie.
Hi, Paul. How are you? Good to see you. And thank you, Dr. Field, for the program tonight. One of the other obstacles to home electrification is that there really aren't enough people who know how to do it. We have a real deficit of electricians, a deficit of people who are installers of heat pump technology. Plumbers don't know how to do it either. When you want to do a heat pump water heater, they just say, I don't know how to do it. So we need to have a high level push on education programs, and these should be turning out lots and lots of people who are educated in these technologies, so that they would have well-paid jobs as technicians and doing electrification. Is there any money in the IRA program for such an educational program?
That's a great question, and I totally agree with you that we're rapidly approaching the point where the availability of skilled technicians and installers is going to be critical. I honestly don't know the answer to your question. As Paul said earlier, there are more than 100 specific items in the IRA, and maybe one of the other people in the audience, or maybe Paul knows the answer to that. But I agree, it's critically important.
I'm guessing that the green bank money that you talked about might be used this way for broader community education. Some of the incentives to community groups could be used for retraining electricians to do the required stuff. Debbie, while I have you, you're involved in doing a series of home electrification tours, aren't you? Could you?
Yeah. I'd love to hear doing. We're doing.
Well, take this opportunity to plug some upcoming tours and what you're trying to do.
Great. It is a tour of 20 homes from San Mateo and Santa Clara County, from Millbrae to San Jose, coming up on Saturday the 24th, a week from this Saturday. And the homes will be open from 10 until 4. And these are homes, they have about half of them have become totally electrified, and the other half are people in process. And the homeowners will be there to answer your questions about why they changed, what they changed, how much it costs, who they worked with. You can see things, how they're doing it. They'll have electric vehicles to show, and we'll be doing some cooking demonstrations on induction cooktops. If you're interested to find out about it, you can either write Paul a note and he'll send it to me, or you can go to greenhometours with an S at the end .org and find out more information as well.
Green Home Tours. Would you put that in the chat window so people can?
The chat is disabled.
The chat appears to be disabled.
Oh, it's back.
Okay.
When you promoted us, great.
Okay, I'll do that. It's a free tour, but you have to register.
And thank you for doing that. It is really important to have this community education component, and one of the things that I hope we can see spread nationwide is just an awareness of what you can accomplish with home electrification and how it doesn't need to be stressful or represent any degradation of the quality of life.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that excellent suggestion, Debbie. And hi to Thomas. They're watching over the shoulder. Let's bring Mike on. Mike Cajano, President of Peace Action of San Mateo County. Hi, Mike.
How you doing? Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay, good. Yeah, I saw recently a article about iron air batteries that is being super cheap, scalable, something that might be utility sized answers to storage. Can you give us a little more information? It sounded fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, the short story is that there are a whole bunch of technologies for different battery chemistries that look attractive. The real challenge has been designing a physical package that has the kind of durability that's required for real utility scale applications. And I'm optimistic long term that we will see some of these novel battery chemistries come into maturity, chemistries that don't require the rare minerals that are sustainable, can operate over long periods. And of course, one important feature of the batteries that you want to use for grid stabilization is that they don't need to be lightweight. They don't need to recharge quickly, the things that are high priorities for electric vehicles. And if you were to start from scratch saying, what do I want in a battery for grid stabilization, it'd be very different than a vehicle. So I think we will see the new technologies come online, whether or not batteries turn out to be the big winner in grid backup, especially this massive scale backup, still unclear, but I think there is lots of promise in new battery chemistries, including these iron air batteries.
Great. Good question. Thanks. Did you have a follow-up, Mike?
Well, just basically, it's good when you read these things, you feel optimistic. Where most articles you read so much about the climate, especially politically, you've got a whole political party in this country that just wants to throw the anchor out, pretend it doesn't exist, and stall and stop. And I mean, I'd like to just see this Republican Party decertified. I mean, they're so irresponsible, considering that is the biggest issue we're all facing. I mean, it's just stunning, But it's great when you read these things, you come away saying, I don't have to shoot myself tomorrow.
Yeah, well, let me say one more thing about the technology and the sort of techno-optimism approach, because I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot we can do and a lot we need to do, but it's also important to recognize that with these relatively early stage technologies, there's a big long pathway, even if they turn out to be fabulous, and a lot of them don't turn out to be as fabulous as we think initially. And so one of the things that is really important to keep in mind is that if we are going to make progress on greenhouse gas emissions that are anything close to keeping us within the well under 2C target of the Paris Agreement, we really need to be deploying very rapidly over the next few decades, emphasizing the technologies that we have now at maturity, and continuing to invest in the new technologies we'll need in the out decades, but we can't be waiting for those things. We need to be deploying the technology we have now to have us on anything close to the trajectory we need.
Okay. Thanks again, Mike, for that excellent question. I don't have any audience members in the queue right now, so let me, as we approach the end of our time anyway, go back to the legislation and ask you a couple of things. One of the trade-offs we've learned was this deal with Joe Manchin to change the pipeline permitting process so that they can build this pipeline in West Virginia. A lot of the environmental groups are very much opposed to this. The Progressive Caucus in the House says they won't vote for the funding bill to keep the government open if this is included in that. What's your take? How dangerous is this pipeline permitting, quote unquote, reform?
You know, I wish that we lived in a world where the climate legislation didn't have to include all these softeners for the legacy fossil fuel industries. But I think it is important to remember that with the current function of the United States, we still do need fossil energy for electricity and transportation, and we'll need it for some time in the future. And I guess for me, I view things like the pipeline permitting and some of the other incentives for fossil as being a reminder that we not only continue to need fossil energy to make the economy run and make people's lives satisfying, but we also need to think about designing future fossil infrastructure for being phased out. And I don't think there's ever been a time in history when we said, okay, I recognize that I need to deploy a big new infrastructure for something, but I really want it to go away in 20 years or in even 15 years. And when we look at things like new pipelines or new fossil power plants, new gasoline powered vehicles, I think we ought to be designing in the obsolescence. We spent decades trying to not design in obsolescence, but with this technology, we need to make sure that we're investing in avoiding lock-in, and I think that the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't do that. I wish it had. And as we think about how to deal with the fossil infrastructure that is coming, either through incentives in the IRA or from other mechanisms, we ought to be increasingly focused on how to prevent that fossil infrastructure from having a lifetime longer than it should to be consistent with our climate goals.
Boy, yeah, that's a really excellent point. To kind of follow up on that about what's not in the bill, the original Build Back Better plan, of course, had $550 billion targeted for climate programs rather than the 370 that finally made it through. What would you do with the other $180 billion if you had it to spend?
Well, I think that there are some critical things that we haven't yet begun to pay attention to, and I want to emphasize something that wasn't in the Build Back Better either, and it's paying more attention to the international landscape of climate action. The U.S. has the $370 billion to put into climate action. But remember that the U.S. represents only about 5% of the world population. And in most countries of the world, the financial resources to drive rapid decarbonization just aren't there. And it doesn't really make sense to even think about electric vehicles in Nigeria or Indonesia or countries that are really struggling to even have an electrical grid. So I think that if we're going to be anywhere close to the target of the Paris Agreement, we really need to be a lot more serious about distributing the benefits of the technology we have, either with direct international assistance or with at least meeting the commitment of the adaptation aspirations in the Paris Agreement. So I really think that the world would benefit and the U.S. would benefit from a commitment of on the scale of many tens of billions of dollars a year for accelerating the decarbonization in poor countries around the world, and for investing in adaptation to let those countries make infrastructure and other kinds of investments that'll help them cope. I think that's the huge missing element in where we are with climate action in 2022.
Yeah, excellent. Help the rest of the world as well. And on that note, I'll make my last question. Even though you're no longer a member of the working group of the International Panel on Climate Change, you still go to the annual conferences. And there's another one coming up in November, the first 2 weeks of November, COP27, the Conference of Parties. And before we went on the air, you were talking about you'll be going to that one in Cairo, that one of the things you expect to hear is you need to be helping the rest of the world financially like this. What else do you expect at COP27? You never know what to expect at these things, I guess, but.
Well, I do think the dominant threads of conversation are going to be around this topic that's often called loss and damage in UN speak, to the rich countries, owe the poor countries reparations for the climate damages. And I don't anticipate that this Conference of the Parties is going to make a decision on that, but I think it's important to bring it into focus. If I look at what's happened in climate over the last several years, what has really changed dramatically is this sense that we are currently in a climate crisis in almost every country in the world, and that it is experienced through these increasingly severe extreme events, and that the presence of the climate impacts around the world is a strong motivator, not only for increased investments in mitigation, which are coming through things like the Inflation Reduction Act, but I think we're really behind the curve for investments in adaptation. There are substantial investments for adaptation in the Inflation Reduction Act, but I'm expecting that COP27 will really focus on the role of adaptation and trying to create an environment in which individuals, communities, ecosystems aren't left behind in their ability to cope with the climate crisis. And my expectations are modest. These COPs have a tendency to overpromise and underdeliver. I hope that there's a new level of seriousness, and I think that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be a powerful incentive for sort of raising the bar on the commitments, recognizing that there's only so much you can do in a UN setting.
Okay, well, I will hold out hope that there is a breakthrough, so I can invite you back in December or January to get a report on that.
I look forward to
with
that.
We'll let that go, and I will say thank you once again to Chris Field, Director of Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Thank you so much for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to be with all of us here tonight.
And thank you, Paul. I also want to thank the questioners for really insightful questions and comments. It's been a pleasure interacting with all of you.
Yeah, they were good questions tonight. And thanks to Sean George for clicking all the buttons behind the scenes for me tonight. Thanks everybody for coming. We'll be back. Join us next Wednesday, the 21st, for a lunchtime discussion on for Banned Books Week. That's September 21st from 12:15 to 1 p.m., one of our brown bag lunch Zoom meetings. In the meantime, I'll see you next month. Don't know when or what it's going to be yet, but we'll be back next month with other voices. Thanks a lot and good night.